Just days ago, the architects of global security gathered in a sealed, electromagnetically shielded room in Brussels. The agenda was an existential review of Article 3 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the foundational clause demanding that member states maintain their own independent capacity to resist armed attack. The discussions were highly classified, focusing on the rapid militarization of the polar regions, the vulnerability of emerging northern sea routes, and the desperate need for next-generation, long-range aerial defense interoperability. But the most critical piece of intelligence to emerge from this summit was not a new weapons system or a forward deployment strategy. It was an empty chair. Canadian authorities were deliberately, surgically excluded from this preliminary strategy consultation. The United States simply locked them out. This was not a bureaucratic oversight. It was a calculated geopolitical decapitation. We are witnessing the weaponization of alliance architecture driven by an American administration that has fundamentally altered the rules of the transatlantic game. Washington has made it brutally clear. Participation in the highest echelons of continental defense is no longer a birthright granted by geography or historical loyalty. It is a pay-to-play syndicate. Conditional participation tied directly to defense contribution levels is the new law of the land. If you do not meet the financial threshold, you are blinded. You are cut out of the intelligence feed. You are left alone in the dark. For decades, the assumption has been that the North American defense perimeter is an indivisible monolith. But underneath the diplomatic pleasantries, the tectonic plates have violently shifted. To understand the gravity of this fracture, you have to look north. Look at the high Arctic, where the ice is retreating and exposing a vast, contested frontier. The northern sea route is rapidly becoming the most coveted maritime artery on the planet, heavily shadowed by adversarial, nuclear-powered icebreakers and hypersonic missile submarines. Now project yourself into a remote, wind-battered, early warning radar outpost in Nunavut. Imagine the operator sitting in a dimly lit, hyper-cooled server room, staring at digitized screens that trace the jagged edge of the sovereign airspace. They are watching ghost echoes, anomalous heat signatures at the edge of the atmosphere. They rely on an umbilical cord of instantaneous data sharing with American Aerospace Defense Command to verify if that blip is a commercial freighter off course or a decapitation strike inbound. But what happens when that data stream is throttled? What happens when the software updates for the interceptor targeting algorithms are placed behind a geopolitical paywall? The cold reality is that deterrence is only as strong as its weakest link, and Washington has just signaled that it is willing to let its northern neighbor freeze if the check does not clear. Faced with this unprecedented isolation, Ottawa did not issue a public grievance. They did not grovel. Instead, Canadian officials, led discreetly by Mark Carney, executed a silent, deeply subversive pivot. Over the past 72 hours, back-channel communications were opened not with the Pentagon, but with Berlin. They bypassed the American defense apparatus entirely and went straight to German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. This is where the narrative shifts from a diplomatic dispute to an industrial earthquake. Carney and Merz are laying the groundwork to aggressively expedite joint military production ventures. They are actively negotiating the integration of Canadian aerospace and aviation resources deep into continental European acquisition systems. They are mapping out a coordinated approach to next-generation combat aircraft programs. They are doing all of this while technically maintaining their formal NATO and bilateral commitments, smiling for the cameras, and quietly tearing up the blueprints of American hegemonic monopsony. Here at Political Insight Live, we do not waste time reacting to the sanitized press releases handed out in briefing rooms. We track the structural, subterranean shifts of capital, technology, and power that dictate the next half-century of human history. And what we are tracking right now is the deliberate dismantling of the American military-industrial monopoly. For the European defense manufacturing sector, particularly the heavyweights anchored in Germany and their allied continental subsidiaries, this Canadian pivot is a historic windfall. We are talking about the sudden injection of massive, untapped revenue streams and the integration of advanced Canadian industrial capacity into alternative procurement pipelines. For generations, European contractors have played second fiddle to the absolute dominance of American defense behemoths. The F-35 program alone was designed to effectively conquer the aerospace procurement budgets of the entire Western world, creating a closed-loop system where allied nations are perpetually dependent on American supply chains, American software patches, and American political goodwill. But Chancellor Friedrich Merz sees the crack in the armor. Merz and his inner circle are moving swiftly to consolidate massive political capital. By welcoming Canadian capital and industrial integration, Merz is positioning Germany as the undisputed architect of a truly autonomous European security posture. This is no longer just a French theoretical ambition. It is becoming a heavily capitalized transcontinental reality. Berlin is proving that it can provide a viable, high-tech alternative to American reliance, transforming the European Union's defense sector into a gravity well capable of attracting other disillusioned partners and billions in foreign investment. Conversely, the dominant American military contractors are facing the beginning of a terrifying, slow-motion erosion. The lock they have held over Allied equipment standards and foreign military sales is slipping. But to truly understand the geopolitical violence of this shift, you have to strip away the macroeconomic theory and look at the bleeding human reality on the ground. Picture a mid-sized, generations-old manufacturing town in the American Rust Belt. Picture a sprawling, heavily guarded factory floor that produces highly specialized avionics components or advanced composite materials for American fighter jets. The workers clocking into the early morning shift believe their jobs are guaranteed by the permanent, unassailable supremacy of the American military empire. They are worrying about inflation, the rising cost of groceries, and their children's tuition. They have no idea that a quiet handshake in a soundproof room in Berlin just shaved 10 years off the lifespan of their assembly line. They do not realize that the global supply chain is being rewired to deliberately cut them out. When the multi-billion-dollar contracts start migrating across the Atlantic, it is not the executives in Virginia who will suffer the most. It is the hollowed-out industrial communities whose economic lifeblood is tied to the assumption that the world has no choice but to buy American. But do not mistake this for a cost-free victory for Ottawa. The defiance of a mid-tier power comes with a brutal domestic price tag, and it is the ordinary Canadian taxpayer who will ultimately bleed for this strategic independence. Building parallel supply chains is a logistical nightmare. When you decouple from an integrated, continental defense architecture and attempt to plug your aviation resources into a European system, you sacrifice massive economies of scale. The cost of raw materials, the cost of research and development, the cost of specialized maintenance, all of it skyrockets. You are no longer buying off the shelf from a hyper-efficient, unified neighbor. You are custom ordering from a fragmented consortium an ocean away. Think about the working-class family in a suburb of Toronto or Calgary. They are already suffocating under the weight of an agonizing housing crisis, stagnant wages, and brutal winter heating bills that force them to choose between keeping the thermostat at a livable temperature and paying off high-interest debt. Now, layer on top of that the invisible, crushing tax burden required to fund a duplicated, entirely separate military supply network. They will be paying a premium for national pride. They will foot the bill for the friction that occurs when a Canadian radar system tries to interface with a German-manufactured interceptor missile while still trying to satisfy the baseline requirements of the North American Aerospace Defense Command. The technical incompatibilities alone will require billions of dollars in bespoke software engineering to bridge the gap. This leads us to the most dangerous consequence of this geopolitical realignment, the catastrophic degradation of alliance-wide operational efficiency. In a theater of war, friction equals death. When you are dealing with hypersonic glide vehicles that can cross the polar ice cap in minutes, you do not have the luxury of running your targeting data through a translation matrix because your radar arrays speak American and your missile batteries speak European. The proliferation of parallel coordination channels, the duplication of command structures, and the fracturing of interoperability protocols mean that the NATO alliance is becoming a fundamentally slower, heavier, and more confused organism. We are trading the brutal efficiency of a single hegemonic standard for the messy, disjointed reality of a multipolar procurement landscape. History is ruthless, and it operates in cycles. What we are observing in the aftermath of this Brussels exclusion echoes the darkest, most volatile precedents of the Cold War. We are watching the precise moment when mid-tier powers begin to incrementally challenge the assumed hegemonies within long-standing alliances. When the periphery stops trusting the core, the empire does not collapse in a sudden explosion. It hollows out. It succumbs to strategic atrophy. In the 1960s, we saw France put forces out of NATO's integrated military command because it refused to subordinate its nuclear destiny to Washington. Today, the battleground is not just nuclear command and control. It is the microchips, the software architecture, and the industrial supply lines that make modern warfare possible. The quiet diversification orchestrated by Carney and Mers is a contagion. It is a signal to every other mid-tier power in the alliance that the American monopoly can be broken if you are willing to absorb the pain of transition. This will inevitably trigger unforeseen ripple effects across the entire spectrum of global procurement norms. If Canada can successfully integrate its next-generation combat aviation with European contractors, why shouldn't the Indo-Pacific allies do the same? We are looking at the gradual, irreversible reconfiguration of transatlantic power balances. Over the coming decades, the centralized authority that Washington has wielded over its allies will erode, replaced by a complex, highly transactional web of regional defense pacts and opportunistic industrial joint ventures. The intelligence-sharing protocols that have kept the Western world relatively secure for 70 years are now vulnerable to profound fragmentation. When you buy a weapons system, you are not just buying titanium and circuitry. You are buying into a classified ecosystem of satellite uplinks, threat libraries, and real-time electronic warfare data. If the hardware supply chains diverge, the intelligence architecture will inevitably follow. We are sleepwalking into a future where allied nations fighting on the same hypothetical front line may be structurally incapable of seeing the same battlefield. Here at Political Insight Live, we refuse to offer comfortable illusions. The narrative of an unbreakable, unified West is a comforting fiction designed for mass consumption. The reality, exposed by the empty chair in Brussels and the secret negotiations in Berlin, is a brutal calculus of sovereign survival, industrial protectionism, and the slow death of a unipolar order. We are witnessing the mechanics of geopolitical divorce. The United States gambled that it could use exclusion as a tool of financial extortion, assuming its partners had nowhere else to go. Canada and Germany have just called that bluff, permanently altering the DNA of the most powerful military alliance in human history. This brings us to the ultimate, inescapable question that will define the security architecture of the 21st century. As the ice melts in the Arctic and the margins of error in global warfare shrink to zero, what exactly are we building? Are we witnessing the necessary, albeit painful, birth of a more resilient, multipolar defense alliance where Europe and mid-tier powers finally take ownership of their own survival? Or are we watching the arrogant, foolish dismantling of the only unified military-industrial shield that actually worked, sacrificing the speed and efficiency of American hegemony for the vanity of fragmented independence? The answer to that question will determine whether the next major conflict is won in the air or lost on the assembly line. Leave your perspective in the comments below. We read every single one, because the debate you are having down there is the exact same one tearing apart the war rooms in Washington, Ottawa, and Berlin. Subscribe to Political Insight Live, and never let them tell you the system is stable.